G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic Monday and a brilliant start to your week. Now legends, of course I'm on my third day of chemotherapy and I need to go in for some infusions, so just bear with me. This video may be a little bit more quick and I haven't had the time to research as in-depth as I usually would. But I'll be finished in a couple of days. Now, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to be looking at maps, geolocations, comparing maps, and I want to show you something very interesting that I've been seeing about logistics as well. I'm going to break down some delusions that are still taking place in this sphere, which I cannot believe that they are. We're going to look, of course, at Mr. Trump sitting down in Europe on the chair on the side of the hotel room and telling them how it is going to go. We're going to talk about not only the tariffs, but we're going to look at European sovereignty and independence, something we have spoken about before. When you're completely reliant on just one party, do you become a vassal state? And of course, as is mentioned daily by everyone from leaders to bloggers and everyone in between, the imminent Russian economic collapse. And we're going to look and talk a little bit more about, is this something that is on the horizon? If so, how close is it? So let's start here. Of course, overnight we have seen large drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. Now, the actual numbers don't seem to be anything that is out of the ordinary. Again, as I spoke about 2 videos ago, we are expecting a very large drone attack soon, giving that sort of 4, 5, 6 day gap that Russia tends to do. But the Gebura drone, this is one of the decoys that gets used along with the grants, for a long time was thought to just be just that, just a decoy. And one of Ukraine's most respected online bloggers, especially when it comes to drones, Serhiy Flash, he has reported this: our adversary actively uses powerful Chinese modems on Gebura UAVs, which allow establishing radio communications with UAVs over long distances, so working as repeaters, such as Geburas actively conduct reconnaissance for Shaheeds, so they can triangulate positions and talk to one another. I ask all my colleagues involved in UAV electronic warfare, both military and civilian, to monitor 1300, 1500 megahertz range, especially during alerts. We're searching for frequency hopping and broadband signals with these bandwidths. So of course what frequency hopping does is it hops as it does between frequencies, but the other drones will have a key in them that can hop so they can still talk to one another. It's one of the more easy ways to have more secure military communications. We've spoken about this for some times, of modems, routers, even SIM cards being on drones, being able to triangulate positions on the ground and act as a repeater to others. You and I shared with you guys over 12 months ago a guy in the space specifically telling me about this. So let's have a look at the maps. I'm going to talk a lot about Pokrovsk. So here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, of course, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Let's come down into Pokrovsk. We see, at least on the deep state map, no changes being shown today. I will say the amount of maps we have today is very short. Both AMK and Suryak at time of filming have not released maps. I'll update you with any of that tomorrow. But I want to show you a couple of interesting things. So we see a lot of posts coming out like this, and this is nothing but delusion. Demented Western generals who have not seen a day of combat in their lives accredit Pokrovsk as a logistics hub. Logistics hub to where? The entire story is ridiculous. There's quite a paradox in what you have said and then what you have shown on this photograph. A logistics hub to where? Well, Ukraine was using it as a logistics hub into the occupied parts of the Donbass, and Russia will use it, once captured, as a logistics hub into the parts that they are wanting to capture in the Donbass. Your red lines here show me all that I need to know. But this got me doing a little bit more digging on the importance of Pokrovsk, not only the highways, but also the railways. Now, of course, since 2014, there has been Ukraine under Kyiv, and there's been parts of Ukraine then occupied, and those two weren't connected. So what we got was this, what many referred to as the railway gap. So you have these areas that have been cut off by railway since 14, or since, of course, the war in 22 till now. Quite commonly looked like this, of course, has looked different throughout, and new railways have been built. But let's have a look at right here where we see multiple railways heading out. What area, what city do you think sits right there? And if we zoom in on that, you get Pokrovsk and Mazova. Railways that in these regions have been sitting like this unconnected for a long time, that potentially if Russia gain this area and then push well past this, could be able to access then more Ukrainian railways heading deeper into the Donbass if there is further then collapse of the line, which is not uncommon once you see a major area fall for it to push 10, 15, 20 kilometres past. But let's talk about this more. David D, Secret Squirrel. Well, I think everyone in the space questions a lot of URX intelligence coming over this. For your information, if Ukraine falls back to the line, new line, it's 5 or 10, 14 kilometres depending on the location. The new line has been built for the last 18 months, which he is correct. Of course, it's right in here. He is showing, I believe he has stolen play for his map here, but he is showing where Pokrovsk is and where this line is. Again, you can see the importance of Pokrovsk as a logistics hub. You can also see the big gap in the line that many people are asking what the hell is going on there, as, of course, the eastern flank pushes exactly for that. But what isn't being spoken about in this is who is there to fill the lines? Does Ukraine have enough infantrymen to fill those lines? If lines aren't filled with guys, then it's just a big, expensive, at best, speed hump. And if Russia then break through that line, what's then behind this? Okay, that's what we need to be asking about. That it's not just fall back to here and, okay, everything is good to go from there. That puts the front line only 68 kilometres apart from the 2014 line. Again, as I always say, these people don't understand the very, very basics of attritional warfare. The territory is a byproduct of attrition. Then it gets more delusional again. But many, many people in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, fully well believe this is how war is being fought. And that's what I'm trying to push back on, because I think people like this spreading this actually have blood on their hands, as it can hide accountability, make mistakes, etc. plays a big role. So Kyiv is about 600 kilometres away. And at 1 million dead per 60 kilometres, that's another 10 million dead Russians. And to get to Lviv at this pace is 183 years. And I this morning ran 20 metres in 3 seconds, so I'm going to break the marathon world record this afternoon. This is not by any way, shape or form how attritional warfare works like this. And this is where this can be very, very dangerous. And back to my initial questions of, if there is a fall back to that 15 kilometre back line, what sits beyond that, and how many people are there to man this also? But again, this is what we're seeing. We need to actually look at some data to suggest some things too. This is from Mediazona. The recorded names of dead Russians is 119,000. The probate registry estimates 165,000. So around that number. Now, what you can see on this, and many people tell me to look at Mediazone, look at Mediazone. Now, this gets slightly skewed because people are saying, oh, Russia's suffering less and less losses, which I believe is correct, but not in the way or not as much as people may think. Because, of course, KIA gets added and backdated. So the more recent days, you're going to have less data than previous weeks or months. So it can create that illusion. That said, if we look back in January, February, March, now many, many months ago, it does show a fall, and I would presume that the majority of the information is in. And this is something we have been seeing, especially when it comes to equipment losses, that Russia is making more gains with less equipment loss and seemingly less personnel losses as well. And we know that Russia is still expanding the amount of troops on the front line. Pokrovsk is a very, very important step in this war and has the potential, when I say has the potential, I don't mean it's going to, but it has the potential to mean that there's going to be much larger movements. And what this really relies on is how many resources and men is Ukraine willing to push into Pokrovsk to try and hold it. Do they need to hold it, or else you're going to see a big step on the front line and outflanking other areas? And with manpower crises, how many men are actually on those defensive lines? We know Russia's using more light vehicles at the moment and has a massive storage of armoured vehicles. May that be used against the lines? We will see. We do have an important vehicle loss. So Pokrovsk the other day, I spoke about one of the big changes that I saw was the use of TOS thermobaric in the way that Russia capture these areas. And we can see some 10 kilometres from where it was hitting down at this geolocation here, Ukrainian drones have successfully targeted a Russian TOS multiple launch rocket thermobaric system. We can see the targeting in here. Now, from the footage here, it doesn't seem, you can see an explosion, but I think it may have already fired off its missiles because you'd see that more fireworks display. But those TOS cause havoc for an area like this. So let's then talk about the other area I think being ignored, but we need to really, really look at as far as Kupyansk. Now, what we can see is this large amount of grey zone around Moskova, of course, coming right into the middle west of Kupyansk, and of course, making this envelopment. And this road through here, some of these supply roads in Kupyansk, this is a big, big problem. We have seen a lot of Russian missiles and glide munitions taking out bridges from Kupyansk from the west to the eastern side, and this Oskil creates a huge issue in here. Glad to see the Kindrashivkia Island boys are still hanging out. But let's have a look at this, and let's have a look at some other maps also. So Deep State say this, and they give a geolocation just down in here. The enemy is trying to enter Kupyansk from the north. The defence forces are taking measures to drive out the assault groups of the Russians who are trying to establish themselves along the road from Radkivka near the gas station from Hulyabivka towards the private sector. The situation is complicated by the fact that the enemy has a large penetration area reaching as far as Sobolivka. The enemy's goal is clear: to stretch the combat lines of the Ukrainian defence forces, make a breakthrough, and further block the city from the western side. Absolutely, that's clear. Stretch the Ukrainian lines, whether it is in Sumi, whether it's in the south, whether it is wherever, create break-ins and use their numerical advantage in their favour. And, of course, from the western side, Sobolivkia area, this is becoming a real problem. We have a Russian sources map in here showing that the Russians have gained basically where this grey zone is showing that more of this is actually under their control. So wait out on this, using similar geolocations, but wait out on Kupyansk. And as I said yesterday, we may see a simultaneous crisis in Kupyansk and Pokrovsk. And what the Russians will be banking on is that Ukraine does not have the amount of resources available to defend against both. Or the amount of resources poured in massively implicates a catastrophic rate of attrition at the moment as well, and manpower rates, and exploits that. Kupyansk as well, just to the south, is the beginning to some of the main lines of rail also, where we see that railway gap. So let's actually move further just onto the maps as is. And we're going to talk about Sumi and, of course, this area of Kindrakivka up here as well. Now, let me bring up my slide. Lots of reporting, media, bloggers, rumours, everything, they suggest that several Russian brigades have been completely lost in Kindrashivka. Now, I haven't seen any really reliable pages speak of this and actually give numbers. I've seen plenty say there's been large loss here, but that isn't any different from the usual of how an attritional war like this goes. And I've seen some footage of losses, but I haven't seen any footage that suggests several brigades of losses. And what I will say, Sumi is used very much optically as well. Has there been large losses up here? Probably. We saw Ukraine take back some ground. We saw Ukraine take back a small village settlement in here. Okay, we definitely saw that. But optically, this is being used to distract from the real catastrophes that are occurring in Kupyansk and Pokrovsk. So did it happen? Maybe. Wait out. We'll get more information as it comes. Is there incentive to inflate this? 1,000% there is. And it comes a lot from pages like this Belarusian Slovak as well. Again, not a usual source that I'd use. Today, my friends confirmed the fighters of the 30th Motorised Rifle Regiment, who held their positions until the very end, have permanently remained in Kondratkovka and the Sumi direction. Unfortunately, it was not possible to break through them. The enemy was simply non-stop shelling with HIMARS, knocking out artillery. All this is accompanied by continuous FPV carousel attacks. Internal memory to the guys: to be warriors, to live forever. Now, battles in Alexeyevka are ongoing there, and that Ukraine has transferred a colossal number of reserves from other directions. Now, yes, this is one of the problems, though, with extending the front line, is to have success up here and colossal numbers. Well, we know where then they are not going to be at those more important directions. And Russia will have more incentive to give up ground like this and fall back than Ukraine will in any of this. And this is the problem. When one country is trying to recapture territory and one country is trying to gain territory, is Russia has more incentive to pull back and move forward. Ukraine has very little incentive to pull back, especially because they are working on optics and external support. And optics matter significantly more in the media to Ukraine than they do Russia. It's a very, very difficult situation. So let's move into Siversk. Now we see Siversk right here. And what we do see on this map today, if we turn off this red check, from yesterday, if it will load, till today, we see a large expansion of grey zone between Horovkia and Verkhono-Mayansky. Now what we don't get is we don't get the movement and geolocation up through here. So there was troops here. So this map is definitely behind here. But we do see that grey zone move. And then we see then some of the Russian maps sharing this too. This geolocation out in this area here, showing where there was targeting and movement, and that's where that grey zone has expanded, but it's not showing up through the Kremenar forest, which is very interesting that it won't. Well, it's not interesting that it won't show that, we know that, but this in the forest is a very interesting advance to me, given the difficulties of moving through very, very close terrain. Eastern side of Pokrovsk, small advancement near Popov Yar, as well as Velika Novosilka. Russia filling in more ground around Podubne, and we'll see this down to Voskorenskia. I think in 4 days we'll see this fill in to step into another month. Zeleny Hay, Iskra, more heading in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast as well. Again, still behind all of the geolocations shown in Zeleny Hay, and still behind all the geolocations shown in Malivkia. We know Malivkia, Zeleny Hay are under Russian control. We know that by not one geolocation, but several flags going up, and acceptance by front lines as well. In the south, we do see this grey zone head right into the southern areas of Stepnogorsk. Now this, we don't know if it is confirmed advancement. We have this geolocation right there, and what we have is Ukrainian drones targeting then a building that we presume that there's Russian fighters in. So grey zone is the correct colour for that at the moment, but this map is very behind. I was going to show you the kilometre squares today. I'll show you in a couple of days and see if we get a better idea. Now let's talk about Trump, Ursula von der Leyen, and these tariffs that have come through and Europe really rolling over. And many are trying to sell this as a good thing. Europe trying to build their industrial and manufacturing at the moment. I don't see how this is a good thing at all. This comes from Financial Times. How the European Union succumbed to Trump's tariff steamroller. They speak about in Liberation Day tariffs back in April 10 that he had inflicted on the world earlier that month had sent financial markets into a tailspin as investors dumped US assets over recession fears. Since then, it's been very green. But Brussels blinked too. On April 10, suspended its retaliatory tariffs and accepted the US offer of talks with a knife at its throat. 10% tariffs. Under the framework deal struck by European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen and Trump at his Turnberry Golf Resort on Sunday, the EU has swallowed a broad-based baseline US tariff of 15%, including crucially for cars, but not steel, which will be subject to quota system. Relief among many policymakers about avoiding an immediate transatlantic trade war has tinged with regret. Could the EU, the world's largest trading bloc and supposedly an economic heavyweight, supposedly, have extracted better terms had it pulled its punches early on? One diplomat said, referring to Trump, he's the bully in the schoolyard and we didn't join the others in standing up to him. Those who don't hang together get hanged separately. A former Commission official who helped negotiate UK's exit from the bloc said the EU's most recent threat to apply 93 billion euro tariffs, retaliatory tariffs against US goods came far too late. Trump views the EU as a parasite, feeding off the lucrative US market while closing its own through regulation and standards. The US president has said the union was formed to screw us and was nastier than China. But the Commission president and her close aides argued the potential damage from additional Trump measures, including threats to impose specific tariffs on critical sectors such as EU pharmaceuticals, meant the risk of spiralling trade war was too great. There was also concern about more confrontational stance towards Washington, Europe's dependency on America's security guarantee, as far as there's a risk that Trump could cut off weapons supplies to Ukraine, pull troops out of Europe, or even quitting NATO. Again, the US needs NATO as an arm of power into Eurasia. The European NATO, they need NATO for security. Very different of how European states and US see NATO. A further priority for the Commission president was to preserve the EU's right to regulate. They love a bit of regulation. The US tech industry has pushed hard for Trump to pressure the EU to weaken its laws regulating online speech and data management. That hasn't happened. They also oppose national digital taxes. So far, Ursula von der Leyen has refused to compromise on those issues. After Trump rebuffed a deal hatched by his own officials, the Commission's negotiating team concluded they had no option but to accept a US tariff of 15%. There is no hiding the fact the EU was rolled over by the Trump juggernaut, said one ambassador. Trump worked at exactly where our pain threshold is. And we know that the meeting took just 75 minutes. And when they returned, Trump was triumphant. Europe agreed to buy $750 billion in American energy products and invest $600 billion in new money in the US to purchase additional US military equipment. Tariffs on American exports will drop to zero. Duties on European goods coming to the US will rise by 15%. Wowzers, that is a bad day. I just want to show you this slide before we get into the further issue I see in this beyond just money. Von der Leyen put this on her Twitter. Together, the EU and US are a market of 800 million people, nearly 44% of global GDP. The top comment on this was, well, so the biggest trade deal ever means the EU drop tariffs, EU commits at $750 billion for US energy, you invest $600 billion, you buy more US weapons, the US slaps 15% tariffs. One side got a deal, the other side got a bill. But we need to have a look at how relative this is to GDP. And we need to put it into purchasing power parity too, because something to make the EU is, of course, significantly more expensive than other areas. And we see another economic juggernaut not only rising, but overtaking. So the purchasing power parity GDP of US EU is around 33.5%. The core BRICS countries is 41%. BRICS Plus is at 44%. Where it gets scary is when we look at populations, growing populations and economic future. BRICS Plus is 46% of the world's population, and EU-US is 9.7%, with many shrinking in this also. But this raises a whole nother issue, and something that I've spoken about before, about sovereignty and independence. And I got sent this across many months ago, and you've probably seen this many times, that sovereign, the authority of a state to govern itself. And you have pillars of sovereignty on key areas of economic, trade, defence and energy. And these factors are foundational to the operation of any state, and as such, if any of them are dominated by another nation who has the ability to threaten or damage your nation by withholding resources, access to markets or security, then you are in fact not a fully sovereign nation, as they can compel you to behave in a desired way. The jump, how high analogy. Gentleman speaks of Canada, and that our relationship with the US is so important, and that we have very limited scope to manoeuvre outside of their desired policy because you're so reliant. Speaks of India as probably being the best example of a non-superpower sovereign state. They are not energy independent, but import a balance of their energy from both Middle Eastern nations as well as Russia. As well, India, they're not militarily independent, but they import a lot of their equipment from both Russia and the US as well. So again, working that healthy balance of it. If you can't be independent, you need a balance so not one can be cut off. Now let's consider Europe. The argument is that Europeans should cut off Russian oil to increase sovereignty. Additionally, and equally importantly, they've simultaneously decided to levy every sanction imaginable under the sun on Russia and cut off trade with them. So setting aside any ideological or moral argument as to why one might wish to do these things, if we only consider the issue of sovereignty, what have we really accomplished? So leaving ideological differences out of it, just sovereignty, be objective here. Europe now has removed access to Russian energy and replaced a significant portion of that with American energy. Today has doubled down on this, reduced trade with Russia massively, replacing it with American trade. Europe has long been dependent on the US for defence, and as such has completes a clean sweep of the three pillars of sovereignty. So between economic, trade, defence and energy, Europe has lent even further into completely being reliant on the US. This, of course, can have huge impacts. So I'd argue Europe has manoeuvred itself from a position of being a complete vassal state for the US and either significant or complete dependence on the US in three key realms. Now they're at the mercy of whatever policy decisions emerge from Washington. Yes, if your military, your economy, your trade, all of this is based in the US, it's jump how high. So I remain open to discussing arguments around the concepts of how these moves might be for the ultimate good of Europe in the long term. A 5D chess strategy, however. But if we wish to justify it based on the ideas surrounding sovereignty, I call bullshit. He talks about Greenland and Denmark, and that where Denmark is very reliant on the US, and at the end of the day, it is how far should the US go? How far can they actually go? He said it's far-fetched, but it's not what the US should or shouldn't do. The discussion is what they can do. These problems can be extrapolated out onto any European nation. When we ask the hard questions, does removing trade with Russia really improve their sovereignty, or does it simply push them further into the realm of US serfdom? And this was well before any of this came about, and this has just cemented all of this. So let's talk about the Russian economy, because there seems to be this idea, and I shared it yesterday, that Ukraine's front lines are further from breaking than the Russian economy is. And as I said, is that I haven't found any real serious economists who actually believes in that either, especially not since 22-23 hysteria. Some people are going back into the hysteria, and then we have people talking about the recapture of Crimea. Jeremy Warner, who's one of the most experienced journalists, economists in Britain, speaks about this. Don't bank on Russian economic collapse to save Ukraine. Western sanctions have failed to halt Putin's expansionist ambitions. Here are some of the data points. Growth last year was a rip-roaring 4.3%. Unemployment was just 2%. The current account was in positive territory. Debt to the GDP was little more than 20%. And the ongoing fiscal deficit was a modest 1.8%. In normal circumstances, metrics such as these would be considered evidence of a model economy of the type the IMF would dearly like everyone to follow. Certainly, it would not be keeping officials awake at night, unlike many others. But sadly, this is not some pin-up exemplar of switched-on Western economic management. Rather, it relates to Russia, now into its fourth year of war with Ukraine. And it points to an economy that, though showing manifest signs of stress, is easily capable of sustaining the conflict for many years into the future. And this is what our economist that we use on this channel also says. I will have a podcast with him once I'm feeling a bit better. From the start, Western thinking about Russia's capacity to support its ongoing special military operation has been informed by naivety and wishful thinking, and it still is. It's still informed by naivety and wishful thinking and delusion, and much of this goes well beyond just newspaper articles and YouTube videos. It has real effect on suffering and loss at the front line. First, it was quite widely reported that Putin was terminally ill and that his invasion was therefore a last desperate throw of the dice. 3.5 years later, he still appears to be in rude health. Then it was sanctions that would bring Russia to its knees, with what was claimed to be the largest and most effective package of measures ever attempted. They have not. In the event, Russia has found it's relatively easy to circumvent the sanctions and find alternative trading partners to fill the gaps left by one-time Western suppliers and customers. We all know also, as Richard was telling us, that they knew this was going to happen since 2014, so they started setting up for this. As it is, Europe continues to buy quite considerable amounts of oil, diesel and gas from Russia, and the US has issued multiple import waivers and fertilizers to bizarrely nuclear fuel rods. You can see by this graph how Europe has become heavily dependent on US gas and further dependent as it continues. The bottom line is that sanctions haven't worked as they were supposed to. The latest 18th such package of measures from the European Union is equally likely to fail. Russia has admittedly found it tough coping without normally traded Western goods, part of the reason why Russia's largest car maker, Avtotaz, this week slashed production was the growing difficulty in sourcing required components. But necessity is the mother of invention, and the Russian economy is proving much more resilient than widely supposed. So resilient, in fact, the regime recently reimposed fiscal rules suspended at the time of the pandemic. The National Wealth Fund has set its assets to 2% GDP, Treasury cash balance at 3%, 3.5%, and the reserves stand at $350 billion, even ignoring the roughly $280 billion of Russian assets frozen by sanctions from Euroclear and elsewhere. Russia's economic buffers are more than adequate for Putin to continue his war in Ukraine on an almost indefinite basis. There is, of course, good reason for challenging the integrity of the Russian data. Putin lies about almost everything else. So why not the economy? Economic statistics are easily manipulated and frequently are in autocratic regimes. Following pressure from some member states, the IMF has suspended its normal Article 5 assessments of the Russian economy, leaving little in the way of authoritative external monitoring of what's really going on in the economy. We can, for instance, be pretty certain that inflation is well above the officially quoted level of 10%. I would say inflation in Australia and the US is way above what is officially reported as well. Why else would the Russian central banks be sustaining a 20% interest rate? And we do know that inflation can be a lot to do with unemployment rate too, that you've now got factories running 24 hours a day, you've got massively low unemployment, therefore you've got a lot more people in the market, supply and demand, you're going to have further inflation also. And those same high interest rates are causing the economy to slow precipitously. With car sales down a quarter so far this year, even the regime itself admits to a significant downturn, with the Minister of Economy talking about the brink of recession. But once again, we had the egg shortage, the potato shortage, strap in for the next one. But the overheating of the past 2 years, this is in some respects a necessary correction and won't of itself cause Putin to downgrade his war aims. Sustained by higher levels of military spending, perhaps as much as 8% plus of GDP, well below what the Soviets were spending, the Russian economy is a long way from the abject collapse many Western commentators seem to imagine. And it says a lot about the economists who are all suggesting this versus the bloggers saying much different. I'm trying to be careful in expressing myself here because commentary like this is open to misinterpretation. I don't want to come across as a Russian apologist. It's not just the Russian managed to cope relatively well with the seemingly never-ending war. The Ukrainian economy too has proved remarkably. No, the Ukrainian economy is completely reliant on donations and would collapse in a minute if it wasn't. But it's very funny that even an economist sharing just data has to say this. Whoa! I'm sharing data, but it's open to this. That's the West and the UK for you. I'm not saying anyone's better, but it's funny you have to sort of preface that. Nor is it surprising that Ukrainians should seize the idea of economic collapse for salvation. They have to be given some reason of hope. Protests against Zelensky this week, the first of their kinds since the war began, suggest their patience is wearing thin. There are, moreover, precedents for such an implosion, most notably Germany towards the end of the First World War. There came a point where Germany's economy was unable to sustain its wartime footing, but as of yet, there's little hard evidence of the same thing happening today in Russia. On the face of it, Putin has ample resources to carry on. Demographic shrinkage in the population, made worse by the appalling toll the war has taken on the Russian youth, poses a major threat to long-term economic health. This is post-war attrition. But that's a problem of the future, and there are plenty of things that could bring down Putin in the meantime. Regrettably, the economy is obviously not one of them. But as his title says, this is what people are completely banking on. Trump is threatening 100% tariffs on those who import from Russia if it fails to sue for peace. But few take him seriously. If India and China stop buying Russian oil, they'd be forced to seek alternative supplies, causing the oil price to skyrocket. Any action by Trump on secondary tariffs would in any case invite fierce Chinese countermeasures, including likely a ban on rare earth exports to the US. Trump would soon discover that he doesn't hold all the cards. Alternatively, Western allies could potentially starve Russia into submission by further bearing down the price of Russian oil exports. Without his revenue stream, the Russian economy would soon be in serious trouble, but so would other economies as well, because Russia can produce oil a lot cheaper than other states. The EU last week cut the price cap, enforced by a refusal to insure ships for anything priced at more than $60 a barrel to 47.6, but the US has yet to agree. What's more, the cap has in practice always lacked teeth. Russia has found multiple ways around it. because other countries, it's just these countries doing it. Sorry to say, but the Russian economy, if possibly not its people, is capable of sustaining the current madness for a lot longer yet. And again, people say, why don't you speak about the economy? Because every economist that I either speak to or read about who is serious, they say this, that there is some trouble, it's cooling off, but it can sustain the war. Legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.